Transportation by George F. Kennan from Around the Cragged Hill, first published 1993. Transportation. At no time in its entire history does the United States appear to have had anything in the nature of a rational and sustained governmental policy on transportation. The government, with public approval, seems to have been content to leave developments in this field entirely to the chaotic workings of the free enterprise system, allowing those workings to carry us where they might, regardless of the growing evidence that they were having profound effects on the social and economic conditions of our society. Thus, there was a time, in the 1840s and 1850s, when speculative calculations appeared to favor the building of canals. The result was that great quantities of capital and of backbreaking labor were poured, with the government's blessing, into such enterprises, only to find most of them suddenly and wholly overtaken, a few years later, by the development of the railroads, leaving a great part of the canal investment and its results wasted and abandoned. Society, one way or another, was the loser. The same thing happened little more than half a century later, when what was by then the world's greatest railway network, constructed at vast cost and representing a veritable triumph of American engineering and technology, was sacrificed with equal abruptness, recklessness, and abandon to the compelling commercial intrusion of the automobile. In each case, not only were enormous capital investments and material values light-heartedly sacrificed to the ultimate detriment of society as a whole, but the trends of urban development, sensitive as these are to the available means of transportation, were whipsawed mercilessly by these abrupt and profound changes. Government, in each case, remained indifferent. Nearly 70 years ago, when I was an undergraduate at Princeton, there appeared on that campus a gentleman, whose name and identity I could not possibly now recall, but who left a lasting impression upon me by pointing out, in an evening lecture, that the railway and the automobile exerted diametrically opposite and conflicting disciplines on the development of the urban community, and that this, to the extent that one form of transportation was allowed to exclude or replace the other, was bound to have profound effects on American life. The railway, this gentleman pointed out, was capable of accepting and disgorging its loads, whether of passengers or freight, only at fixed points. This being the case, it tended to gather together and to concentrate around its urban terminus and railhead all activity that was in any way related to movements of freight or passengers into or out of the city. It was in this quality that it made major and in some ways decisive contributions to the development not only of the great railway metropolises of the Victorian age, particularly of such inland cities as Moscow, Berlin, Paris, and Chicago, but even certain of the great maritime turnover ports, such as London and New York. The automobile, on the other hand, had precisely the opposite qualities. Incapable, in view of its own cumbersomeness and requirements for space, of accepting or releasing large loads at any concentrated points anywhere, but peculiarly capable of accepting and releasing them at multitudes of unconcentrated points anywhere else, the automobile tended to disintegrate and to explode all that the railway had brought together. It was, in fact, the enemy of the concentrated city. Thus, it was destined to destroy the great densely populated urban centers of the 19th century, with all the glories of economic and cultural life that had flowered from their very unity and compactness. This, at any rate, is what one undergraduate recalled gathering from this gentleman's remarks, and the impression has never left him. Well, there have, of course, been great changes over the intervening decades in the modalities of urban and non-urban life, changes that neither the lecturer in question nor anyone else could at that time have foreseen. These changes have no doubt modified one point or another the force of the gentleman's observations, but his view of the effects of the automobile on the great Victorian railway metropolis have certainly been mainly substantiated by the intervening decades. And indeed, in some respects, these effects have gone beyond what he predicted, for not only have they damaged the center city, but they have exploded with equal violence the suburban settlement, which once connected with the center primarily by the interurban trolley line, had begun to consolidate its own life as an independent community. The automobile, in short, has turned out to be, by virtue of its innate and inalterable qualities, the enemy of community generally. Wherever it advances, neighborliness and the sense of community are impaired. One might have thought that this alone, much of which was surely becoming evident in the 1920s and 1930s, would have sufficed to cause Americans of that day to pause, and to ask themselves whether they really wished to junk 99% of the great railway system that then existed, and to confer upon the automobile and the truck the sort of near monopoly on transportation, which, together with their later companion, the airplane, they have now achieved. But the wonder as to why this question was never asked is enhanced when it is considered that this, the effect on community, was by no means the only drawback from which the automobile, as an alternative to public transportation, suffered, and continues to suffer. There is, in the first place, its extreme unsociability. Just as it destroys community in human residence, so it destroys community in travel. Surely there has never been a lonelier means of moving great masses of people about. This writer has found himself obliged to drive, on countless occasions, either alone or accompanied only by his wife, the 150 miles between his regular place of residence and the family farm in southern Pennsylvania. The compulsion to do this has arisen because the nearby Pennsylvania village, once connected with the world around it by a small branch railway line, now has, like countless other such villages, no public transportation of any sort to link it to the outside world. In the course of these hundreds of journeys between the 2 points in question, 6 or 7 hours round trip in each instance, the writer cannot recall that he has ever met personally or communicated with another person, unless it be the toll collector at the exit point from the turnpike, who sometimes said hello. Time after time he found himself comparing this lonely and dreary journey with the color and sociability of the English highway in Chaucer's time, as reflected in the Canterbury Tales, or with the congenial atmosphere of the railway compartment of the Victorian novel. Second, there is the automobile's extreme wastefulness. It is wasteful of material, of energy, and of space. The very idea for the displacement of 1 or 2 human bodies on their daily comings and goings should be required something upwards of a ton of metal, the power of something like 100 horses, and some 90 square feet of paved highway, is in itself an absurdity of the first order. The railway is in all these respects far more economical. All this is well known to public authority, and it is at this point that the lack of a national transportation policy transects the similar lack of a policy in the field of energy. And because the automobile is more wasteful, it is also more expensive, to the individual owner and to the economy at large. Third, the automobile is, as everyone knows, a major polluter. So, no doubt, was the steam locomotive, but in a different way, and in far less volume. The source of energy for the electrically driven train also involves pollution, but it involves far less of it than do the many automobiles required to replace it, and even this pollution could surely be further curtailed by other expedients. Fourth, the automobile, insofar as it replaces walking for the displacement of human bodies over short distances, is a distinctly unhealthy innovation. Walking, the experts tell us, is the most useful and readily accessible form of exercise available to the average human being. In an earlier age, adult people walked for a great many of their comings and goings. They walked to and from church, the trolley stop, the corner emporium, the houses of friends. Today, most of these movements are performed expensively, awkwardly, and at the cost of considerable nervous strain in the automobile. The vast majority of children, similarly, once walked to and from school. Today, they sit, passive, bored, and inactive, in the family car or the school bus. And at the slightest sign of inclement winter weather, schools have to be closed, because His Majesty, the automobile, dislikes snow and ice. In the pre-automobile age, this, at least in my native city of Milwaukee, was unheard of. I find it hard to believe that these changes have constituted progress. We have, again, the almost immeasurable boon that the automobile has been to crime and to juvenile delinquency. This scarcely needs elaboration. In the pre-automobile age, the criminal had a limited potential radius of escape. Even within the towns where he committed his crime, he had to walk or to take a streetcar to distance himself from the scene of it, in either of which cases he could easily be observed by others, and not just his head and neck, but his full head-to-foot appearance. To get out of town, he had to pass through the bottlenecks of the railway station, the ticket window, the waiting room, the platform. Today, conveniently anonymous at the wheel of a car, he can within an hour's time be 40 or 50 miles away in any direction from the scene of his crime, and buried among the mass of many thousands of other vehicles and poorly visible drivers. As for juvenile delinquency, any parent can confirm that the varieties of mischief and of self-destructive, sometimes tragic behavior open to the youngster who can escape from parental observation and control in the family car are far greater than those that were open to the teenager of earlier decades, who, to call on his girl, had to walk down the street and sit with her in the family swing on the front porch, or escort her, walking, to the movie. And finally, the automobile suffers from the fact that, enticing as are its services to the able-bodied, it leaves essentially unserved whole great categories of persons: the very young, the very old, the sick, the poor, and the handicapped, who for one reason or another cannot safely and successfully place themselves at the wheel of a car, but who, so long as the automobile retains its monopoly, have no way of getting around, unless they can persuade someone else to drive them. The railway, on the contrary, was capable of accommodating, and normally did, all such people. It is not the intention to argue with these observations that there is no proper place for the automotive vehicle in American life. Of course there is such a place, and it is a prominent one. For fire prevention and control, for police and medical services, for the lonely country dweller living far from everywhere, for taxi services, and for the movement and delivery of freight within major urban areas, and between neighboring ones. It would obviously be silly to reject the advantages the motor vehicle offers. But beyond these and other necessities, there is no reason why that vehicle should be allowed to retain the virtually total monopoly of transportation that it has now generally achieved. There is a large area within which public ground transportation, given even a fraction of the public and private financial support that for many years has been poured out to the automobile, the truck, and the airplane, could provide a healthier, cheaper, more comfortable, socially preferable, and environmentally less destructive manner of moving persons and goods around. It should surely be the task of public authority to determine what should be considered the proper balance among these various modes of transportation, and then to see how pressure could best be brought to bear to steer developments in the desirable direction. It would be wrong to suppose that any adjustment of that sort could be carried through in any short space of time. It has taken 7 or 8 decades to bring about the present unhealthy dependence upon the automobile. It would presumably take nothing less than several further decades to reduce it to its proper place in modern American life. This would be true only for the fact that the personal, financial, and other interests of millions of people would be affected. Even more important would be the psychological adjustment this would imply. But every useful process has to have a beginning, and in this instance, the beginning is far overdue. The power of the automobile as a revolutionizing factor in the life of practically every country worldwide has been extraordinary. Let no one underestimate it. There appears to have been no place in the world that has been able fully to withstand it. The automobile's apparent liberating effect, the feeling of enhanced power it conveys to the person at the wheel, the sense of personal freedom it allows, the ability it promises for instantaneous changes of plans, for escaping from awkward places or situations and for seeking out preferable ones, for expanding the scope of one's activities and for avoiding the delays of movement to or from the railway station or the trolley stop. All these contribute mightily to the illusion of freedom that this vehicle embodies, and constitute enticements few can withstand if the possibility of acquisition presents itself. The fact that much of this sense of freedom is illusory, that the automobile's needs often demand the waste of much time as well as the saving of it, that its expense and its mechanical requirements often simply add to the strains of an already overcomplicated and nervously exhausting modern life, and that it bears the various social disadvantages listed above, all this retires before the force of its attraction. Small wonder in these circumstances that countless millions of people, devoid of any public or social restraints, have placed the apparent personal advantage of driving an automobile ahead of the less easily perceived social disadvantages, and have thrown themselves into a dependence on this vehicle that has assumed the dimensions of an extremely serious and not readily curable mass addiction. It will not be easy to wean them from it. The task of public authority in promoting any adjustment of this nature will be all the harder for the fact that it will have to involve the employment of both the carrot and the stick. Any attempt to reduce the ubiquity of the automobile will be self-defeating unless attractive alternatives are provided in public transportation. On the other hand, no improvements in public transportation will be effective unless serious disincentives are created to the use of the automobile. Because the automobile is now coming up against its own inherent limits in a number of our great cities, where traffic congestion and the cost of parking space are beginning to inhibit its use, certain of these disincentives are already coming into existence. But such self-imposing limits will have little beneficial effect. They will, in fact, only promote the further disintegration and decay of the city centers, unless they are balanced with compensatory improvements and expansion of public transportation. And this last will not occur without the determined and enthusiastic involvement of public authority. It is plain that the federal government has traditionally viewed the providing of freight and passenger movement within the country as a field of activity to be left for exploitation by private enterprise. The assumption seems to have been that so lucrative was this field of activity that private enterprise could be counted on to assure that the needs of all communities and of all classes of society would at all times be met by the private entrepreneur. If the experience of many decades proves anything at all, it is that these expectations were quite unrealistic and have not been satisfied. Instead, we have today a situation where thousands of smaller communities have been left without any public transportation at all, where the movement of freight has been largely abandoned to the expensive, destructive, and heavily polluting trucking industry, where the long-distance movement of persons has been left almost exclusively to the automobile or to the inordinately and, for the poor, almost prohibitively expensive device of the airplane, and where the only fast and reasonably priced public passenger service over even a moderate distance, the rail service between New York and Washington, is one that recent administrations have made no secret of their desire to destroy if they can. The only hopeful approach to the correction of these conditions would require the recognition by public authority at long last that the assurance of reasonably priced public transportation facilities serving not just the rich but the poor, and not just the great urban area but the small community as well, is a proper responsibility of public authority, no less than are those other facilities such as the sewage system and other public health arrangements that are commonly and traditionally recognized as such.